Today's info module is about the relationship between metaphor and technology. So let's first start talking about science and metaphor. At the beginning of the scientific revolution, one of the organizations that came into existence to promote research, publishing research, in fact, they were the first to develop a scientific journal, was the Royal Society in England. It was founded in 1660, and in 1667, a man named Thomas Sprat wrote a book called The History of the Royal Society. Now you'd think 7 years, that's pretty soon to write a history. Well, history here means story or account or relation. What Sprat says about the members of the Royal Society is that they mostly want to make faithful records of their observations so that they can pass on truths and so that truths can be built out of multiple kinds of observations. To do so, he said, we have to remove the colors of rhetoric from any relation of the truth. In other words, don't use any figurative language, don't use any plots, fables, or figurative language in order to describe scientific truth. So scientists wanted to eliminate metaphor from language. He says writers of the Royal Society must reject all amplifications, use a primitive purity of language, deliver so many things in an equal number of words. So what he's saying here really is that words are only used to refer out in the world to things, and that's how scientists should use them. In Gulliver's Travels, there's an island called Legato made up of scientists like the Royal Society members. And these scientists decided that they would just carry around bags of things and instead of talking with each other, would just hold up a thing to communicate something. Well, obviously, that doesn't work. We can't do that with language. Not to mention, what is the John Locke, who tried to eliminate metaphors from his writing, discussed how all ideas come from sensation or reflection. He said, but let us pretend that the mind is white paper. This is the tabula rasa, right? So he has to use a metaphor to explain how the mind is blank. And then he says, how comes it to be furnished? Well, right now the mind has changed from a blank piece of paper into an empty room that you're going to put furniture in it. Whence comes it by that vast store? Well, now it's a business and you bring in goods, this vast store or storehouse of goods. And he says all of these things come from experience. But notice that he really cannot do without metaphor. And in fact, when he has to say why some ideas are stronger than others, he says, well, certain perceptions, certain impressions that come from experience are not deep enough to leave lasting ideas. So here's the notion that an idea in the mind is an impression. So now with these models of how sensation works, let's take a look at the science about bats in the 1800s. So think about that impression, that notion of sensations making an impression on your mind. It kind of goes with Locke's notion of white paper insofar as with the early printing presses, type was pressed onto paper to print it with characters and letters and words. So Georges Cuvier, a natural scientist, he started theorizing about how bats could fly even when they're blind. He says even after their eyes have been removed, they are able to navigate. So he talks about their ears, the ears and the wings of bats receiving aerial impressions. So the movements of the air are pressed onto the bat's wings and ears, and they are able to discern from the movements of the air where things are. That was his theory. So, of course, we are impressed by wind. The science of bats changed in the 1940s radically with radar. Radar is, of course, a way of using signals to detect objects. And here you see some early radar machines. The word radar came into existence in the 1940s as an acronym. You can see here, if you look at the bottom, where it's defined first. Rachel Carson was a famous environmentalist, and she wrote the book Silent Spring. She wrote an article in the 1950s called The Bat Knew It First, and it's about bats using radar. She relied on the work of Griffin and Columbus. She describes their experiments. And what you can see is that the experimenters decided to plug up the bats' ears and to tape their mouths shut. Well, Cuvier wouldn't have plugged up the bat's ears because he thought, oh, the aerial impressions are going all over the ear and the wings. How did they think to plug up the mouth, though? To plug up ears so that you couldn't get sound, and to plug up the mouth. Well, this happened in 1941, and I want to suggest that they were thinking of the model of radar. In other words, thinking about radar as a method for locating yourself if you can't see shaped how they conducted their experiment, what they decided to do to the bats to see how they can fly. The ears are often very large and constitute with the wings an enormous extent of membrane for sensing aerial impressions. It's like a huge sheet of paper on a printing press. Notice when the word echolocation comes into existence, it's in 1944, defined by Griffin in the title of his article, Echolocation by Blind Men, Bats, and Radar. That's when he's conveying the results of his experiments. So now we have new technologies beyond the printing press and beyond radar. We have computers. And computers have been modeled on metaphors from other things. For instance, we talk about a motherboard. So this is the mother of all the things that happen in your computer. We talk about a mouse. Obviously, it just kind of looks like a mouse. But we also talk about ourselves as if we were computers. I had a glitch in my brain. Sorry, that didn't quite compute. Your brain is a network, like the web, like the internet. Your brain is hardware. Your mind is software. In fact, if you Google how does the mind work, one of the first things that happens is a sentence comes up. The brain works like a big computer. So not only are we using metaphors like motherboard to understand technology, we're using the computer as a metaphor for understanding us as human beings. There's an article by a man who works on the biology of mind, and he says, really, the brain doesn't work alone. So if you think of it as working alone, you're creating a kind of cerebral mystique. You're making it seem higher and better than it is. He says the widespread analogy of the brain to a computer contributes powerfully to the cerebral mystique by distancing the brain from the rest of the body. It should be the body there, sorry, typo. So when you say I had a glitch in my brain, you're isolating your brain from your body as if it were a computer. This metaphor highlights mechanical and logical thinking, but it hides the role of the body, the role the body plays in thinking, including in developing metaphors themselves. Your body sits in front of a computer. That's why it seemed like a good idea to compare your brain to a computer. What other kinds of things does the brain as a computer metaphor highlight or hide? That's just an open question. Notice, though, that the cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists and biologists thinking about our brain really reject the notion that the brain is a computer. You don't process information, retrieve knowledge, or store memories in the way that a computer works.